Former FTC chair Lina Khan helping Mayor-elect Zohran Mamdani dig through some obscure laws that could let his administration target New York's soaring costs. Joining us right now is Liz Hoffman, Semafor business and finance editor. She's written a fascinating new newsletter that gets into what Lina Khan's role may be in this next administration. She's, of course, part of the transition team. Liz, what are we expecting to see from Lina Khan?
The question has been, since the election, certainly the business community is asking is, what is she doing there, right? Like, this is local politics. She is a national trust buster. That was the reputation she built at the FTC. And the answer is that actually, if you look at her record at the FTC, one thing she was pretty good at was like looking around at the sort of regulatory toolbox, saying, what do I have to work with, and applying it in pretty interesting ways. And my understanding is that's sort of exactly what she's up to here. A lot of Mamdani's agenda is going to have to get past Albany, have to work with city council. And so the transition is saying, what can we kind of unilaterally do? What's in our remit? And looking at some laws, some very old, some kind of newly passed by Albany that have never really been tested, and saying, let's get out there and tell people that we intend to enforce them.
So give us some examples of these laws. I know you're talking about everything from beer at Yankee Stadium to potentially ticket pricing. I don't know if that's true or not, or hot dogs.
Yes. One avenue they've identified, there's a 1969 consumer protection law in New York City that has the ability, it prohibits any corporate behavior that's deemed unconscionable. And, it's a pretty good pitch to hit if you are a regulator. That's a pretty wide lane to play in. Very rarely been invoked. Kind of the only time in recent memory, I think, was in 2020 when they cracked down on price gouging for face masks. So this is a pretty flexible tool. And the two specific things, and again, these are early, but more than illustrative, these are specific targets that have been talked about. One is hospitals that charge $20 for an aspirin that the patient could get around the corner at Duane Reade for $5. These sort of captive consumers. And the other obvious captive consumer is people at sports stadiums who are charged $15, $20 for a beer. These, prices have gone up. And I think whether you voted for Mamdani or not, or what you think about democratic socialism, that's annoying. That's way more than a beer should cost. And, you have no other options. And so these are sort of pretty juicy targets to hit, I think.
Liz, one of the interesting components of this is there's a unique balance that has to take place. I imagine the role of a mayor is different than the role of potentially a regulator in Washington that oversees an entire country and competition in that regard. Because one of the things you're trying to do, I would imagine, unless you think that the mayor has different ambitions, is you want businesses to be coming to New York City, to be growing and building themselves. And so if you create an environment or even talk about rhetorically an environment where you don't want those things, or you're, quote unquote, cracking down on certain things, depending on, again, how egregious those crackdowns or how egregious those items are. I think beer will agree with, and maybe the aspirin. But how do you see that balance playing itself out?
Yeah, look, Lina Khan was not popular with the corporate community, as you know, Andrew, and is sort of already getting tagged, as a socialist being in the campaign here. I've always kind of viewed her legacy a little differently, certainly, mixed, particularly on the lawsuit front. But I think it's sort of a particular kind of capitalist, honestly, like wants more competition. And, one thing she did at the FTC, and there's not a perfect corollary in New York, but might give you a sense into kind of how she thinks about that balance. There was a 1930s law called the Robinson-Patman Act, and hadn't been a case brought in the U.S. in 25 years. She brought one fairly successfully. And what it says essentially is that suppliers can't charge small distributors more than they charge big ones. Which sort of flies in the face of what we all think about capitalism. Obviously, Walmart gets better deals all the time than the corner bodega. But there's pieces of that are a little illegal. And I think there's certainly a piece of kind of the small business economy that they'll be very tuned to here. That's obviously a federal law, not a city one. But I think that, if they can get Yankee Stadium to charge less for a beer, but get a better distribution pricing for, New York loves its bodegas. I think wants to see them thrive.
How do you see longer term just the relationship between the mayor-elect's administration and the business community playing itself out? Because I oftentimes think about when Mayor Bloomberg was the mayor in New York City, By the way, he raised taxes on the wealthiest in New York, probably by more than any mayor in recent memory. And most of the wealthy in New York did it with a smile on their face. I mean, there was not a fight, interestingly enough. And I think that was because either he was one of them or there was a sense that he wanted them to succeed or something. You tell me. But I just wonder whether you think that that kind of relationship is going to be what this is going to look like, or it's going to look a lot more antagonistic, and therefore what that ultimately looks like.
I think at the moment it's a lot more antagonistic. Look, he was obviously solving for his own constituencies, but I think Mamdani, perhaps missed an opportunity in his victory speech to extend an arm a little bit. Has not done much outreach as far as I'm aware in my reporting. I do think, you're absolutely right about Bloomberg. And in fact, Bill de Blasio has kind of the opposite problem and was giving an interview recently and said, essentially, I think I could have taxed them more if I'd just been nicer to them. that rich people, particularly in New York, they don't like being taxed, but they really don't like being scolded. And they really feel, rightly or wrongly, that they sort of help build the city. Certainly that they underwrite a huge portion of it. I think the top 1% of New Yorkers pay for something like 40% of New York in the taxes, personal city taxes. So I think there's, you can get away with a lot if you strike the right tone. That said, I also think that Mamdani has been a little bit unfair. I'm not sure he's been wildly antagonistic. He ran an affordability campaign that identified a real problem, but not exactly a villain. There were like some half-hearted kind of, head fakes at corporate greed. But, it was sort of a relentlessly positive campaign that did not call for heads on pikes, really. I think if you were a casual observer of that campaign, you would have come away thinking, yeah, he thinks that things are too expensive, but not that we should have pitchforks in the streets. And I think the business community overreacted to that a little bit. So I think there is a chance to recalibrate. We'll see if it happens.